Hello and welcome to the Talking Food with Bidfood podcast. I'm Joe Anglis, and on the menu for this episode, we'll be talking about the top food and drink trends for 2023. I'm really excited to say that we'll be joined by a true expert in this area, as later on we'll be discussing this with Michelin star chef Michael Caines, MBE. Michael is one of the UK's most celebrated and acclaimed chefs. He's a successful and imaginative hotelier, a respected spokesman for the hospitality industry, and he is a patron and fundraiser for a number of national and local charities and community organisations. You may have also seen him on TV too, as he is a regular on programmes such as Saturday Kitchen, MasterChef, and The Great British Menu. As well as that, he has an amazing collection of hotels and restaurants, including his flagship Limpstone Manor in East Devon. But before bringing Michael on, we'll be discussing the fantastic research and support that our insights team have collated in our food and drink trends report for next year. Every year, our team puts together this comprehensive trend support ahead of the new year, and this is led by our insights and research manager, Holly Rogers. I'm glad to say for this episode, Holly joins me as co-host. So welcome back to the podcast, Holly.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's good to be back.
No problem at all. So to kick things off, Holly, please can you share a bit of an overview of the process for how you come up with the food and drink trends for next year?
Yeah, of course. So quite a lot of research and work has gone into coming up with the trends for next year. We've done a real mix of different things. So we worked in partnership with CGA by Nielsen IQ, which are an out-of-home insights specialist partner of ours. And within that, we commissioned some interviews of food and drink influencers and chefs that have really wide following on social media. We also did a bespoke consumer survey to over 2,000 UK consumers to really understand the main trends, the flavours, the behaviours that they're looking at out of home. And we also did a wealth of desk research as well to add to this. So any of the key themes that we got from our bespoke consumer survey and interviews, we then went and explored further with desk research. And then finally, we also went out in London and also Brighton to actually visit different restaurants and speak to operators and see how the trends that we'd identified were actually cropping up on menus, and also what consumers seemed to be enjoying on the high street. And that was a really interesting process because we got to ask different questions to the chefs and the operators in those restaurants as well and really understand their perspectives behind the trends.
Yeah, I bet. And what were the key trends that were highlighted in the research?
We came up with 6 key food and drink trends this year, and some of them have sub-trends within them. So the first one is conscious choices. We've then got flavors less traveled, which is all about different cuisines that are trending. We've got pizza evolution, in the spirit, nature's gifts, and retro love. And I'll go into a little bit more detail later in the podcast on what is covered in those trends.
That's great. Thank you, Holly. I'm really looking forward to hear Michael's thoughts on all of these and if he can bring any of these ideas to life as well. So without any further delay, let's bring him onto the podcast. Welcome, Michael, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be with you.
So before we look at any of the food and drink trends for 2023, we'd really like to gauge your thoughts on how important it is to consider food and drink trends when planning menus at a time when it's really tough because we're facing a cost of living crisis and recessionary conditions. So in your opinion and knowledge of the market, are chefs and operators interested in trends right now? Or is it your feeling that they are wholly consumed by the operational and cost challenges they're facing on a day-to-day?
Well, I think we're very consumed at the moment with the current crisis and how we respond to that. But it would be wrong not to plan and consider the influence of the trends as we move forward, because ultimately you're trying to attract people to your business. And in doing so, you want to also expand your horizon of opportunity. And so I think actually now is a good time to really focus on what those potential opportunities and trends might be as we seek to perhaps capture the imagination of a new market and also deal with some of the changing economic times, because some of those trends are actually, some of them could be cost effective and also help us perhaps realign our product offer. And what tends to happen in a moment of crisis is it really does expedite trends towards moving towards a certain direction. So it's quite interesting that you actually, if you look at where the direction of travel is in the last 2 years, things like Zoom and Teams and actually working from home were accelerated through a crisis. And I think what we'll see in hospitality perhaps is an opportunity for people to realign their product and come out stronger.
So when we did our insights and research this year to come up with the food and drink trends, we actually came up with 6 key food and drink trends that we believe are sort of set to really shape the eating out market in 2023 and beyond as well. The first of those 6 is conscious choices. And I guess conscious choices is maybe a bit more of a behavioural social trend as opposed to strictly a food trend. But that's all about consumers being more mindful about their decisions in terms of looking at costs, health, sustainability, and just putting more thought, I suppose, into what they're prepared to spend money on when they're out of home. And then we've got flavors less traveled, and it's a bit of an umbrella trend with our cuisines. And that's all about looking at more emerging cuisines that are slightly off the beaten track. So this year we've got Cuban, Pan-African, Sri Lankan, which is definitely my personal favorite. And we've got unusual fusions as well, which is all about a kind of no rules approach to menus and combining maybe less typical cuisines together. We've also got Pizza Evolution, which again, I think some people were surprised at because pizza definitely isn't anything new, but it's just something that we see continuing to grow more and more momentum in the market. And we've got In the Spirit, which is our alcoholic drinks trend. And that covers popular cocktails and the spirits that are trending this year, where the 2 main spirits we're looking at are rum and tequila. And then we've got Nature's Gifts. And Nature's Gift is all about kind of stripping it back to basics. So looking at really natural, sustainable ingredients. We've got 2 sub-trends in that. So one of them is plant power and one of them is foraged finds. And then the final trend is retro love. This is the one that I think at Bidfood we're the most excited about this year because it's quite novel and fun and there's a lot of scope for creativity with that. And retro love is all about kind of provoking nostalgia with food and drink and looking at maybe comfort foods. And there's a lot of desserts that we're seeing on the market now that are, say, themed around confectionery that people remembered as a child or dishes that they might sort of associate with going to their grandma's house when they're younger. So it really helps people who are looking, I think, for a sense of comfort. Quite a lot to take in at once. I just wondered, out of our 2023 trends, are there any that particularly resonate with you? Are any that you're really excited to see emerge this year or that you really think have a lot of potential?
Well, there's a few, actually. I think all of them are well considered. And actually, I don't disagree with any of them. I think that's interesting for me is this sort of less traveled flavor, this idea of these emerging sort of Sri Lankan, Cuban and Pan-African. And certainly we're seeing people's interest in food moving towards certainly Africa, as well as, heading to places like India and Sri Lanka. And Cuban is always an interesting one too. It's one of those things that it opens up that it becomes a little bit more interesting because it's so sort of stuck in a time and traditional. I think conscientious choices you can ignore that with what's going on in the climate, what's going on also with the emerging new generation that perhaps are looking to make more of a conscientious decision about what they buy and its influence and impact it has on the environment is without question one of those things that is definitely there. I think also Nature's Gift, I think, that's also part of that trend of going back to basics, but also keeping it simple and making the most of what we've got. I think it's probably an interesting trend because, Brexit has created a lot of problems in the supply chain too. So I think businesses are being forced to look at what they've got around them more. Not that that trend wasn't there anyway, but, if you can't get the exotic products through the door as easily as we used to at a price that's affordable, then you tend to look at making the most of what you've really got and what you can use. So that's one aspect there. I think if you're looking at things like spirits, I think it's definitely everybody accepts that sort of Guinness has its day and rum is sort of like an emerging trend, and cocktails remain very, very popular. It's interesting that tequila has taken a little bit of a re-emergence as well. But I also think that well-being drinks that are plant-based and also products like, products that are using the idea of using things like CBD and well-being products, I think is really important. I think mindfulness is an emotion, so we call it emotive travel, and is very much a part where people sort of wanting to to live a healthy life, eat a healthy food. But that doesn't mean to say it can't be tasty. We're seeing a move towards more plant-based. So I think they're quite good. And of course, pizza, everybody loves pizza. Pizza's just one of those staples now. It's a bit like the curry is almost quintessentially English or British. I think pizza's now become a staple within most people's offer. It's also a very cost-effective way and a tasty way of eating, very quick and easy as well. So I think all of them really touch on key elements, and they kind of hint to a movement for a sort of young and old generation too. When we're talking about nostalgia, I think there's a lot of that going on. What comes around goes around again. I think that's always the case. But also, I think it's also this idea that some of the stuff that we used to do, perhaps, we kind of very, very quick to move on and try new things. But actually, when you look at what, we used to have, they're actually very, very relevant. I think we just need to, perhaps remodel them. And there's always a need for a young generation coming up through to recreate perhaps a few classics in the past. So I think all of them, I think they're really well chosen. I think when I look at all of them, I think they've all got some really important touch points for our guests, old and new. Certainly, a lot of them also go towards a younger generation that are coming through with conscientious decisions, but also moving away perhaps from the European way of thinking and eating, heading towards places like Pan-African and Sri Lankan food is interesting because they're really not known. So they're very much an emerging taste and very much an emerging market. So that's really interesting to see that as well. Something I'll look out for. I'm gonna go out, Holly, and try Sri Lankan food. And if there's any particular restaurant that you think I should try, then I'll put it on the list. But no, I think so. All of them, I think they all resonate with me. I think they all have significant relevance in the market now. And I think when you talk about foraging, that's it. We've got to do that in a sustainable way. So that always comes with a caveat that says, listen, you just can't go out and rape the countryside looking to forage stuff. And there's a reason why things that are being foraged didn't really make it into the food chain, because a lot of them are quirky, but not necessarily, really easy to grow or in demand. So I think what we're seeing is a lot of the foraged items now being industrially grown because they're becoming popular. So I think foraging is interesting, but I think really I see that more of a reconnection with the land, and also going back to sort of wild food and wild items that perhaps have been lost over time.
That's really interesting. A really good overview as well. One of the things that you mentioned was around nature's gifts. And I understand that showcasing local food provenance and quality messaging is very close to your heart, and you use it a lot in terms of how the foundations of your success have been. So what is it that you think is really appealing to consumers, and why you've been sort of shouting about it so much?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. This sort of notion of farm to fork is still very, very, very popular. I think we have a lot more identity for regional foods going on, certainly through protein based as well. But also we're seeing now, as you say, as people look towards more of a plant-based diet, we're looking also to see what we can get locally in terms of vegetables. And I think that means to say that we're getting a much more seasonal approach in our menus, because obviously the UK has a very short growing season for certain products. And as we're moving out of the autumn into the summer, that becomes slightly more challenging. But I think what's important is that we recognize what we've got and we celebrate that. I mean, we all acknowledge that we haven't got olive groves, and we love olive oil, but rapeseed oil is really good. And whilst not an alternative, is also healthy. And so it's incorporating products like that into our diets, which are also interesting. But it's also acknowledging at the same time that with regionality comes a bit of a sense of taste and a sense of place. There's this notion that if you can only have food from a particular area, not only is that good for the environment in terms of reducing food miles, but also putting a good impact in terms of money in local farms, money in local producers' pockets. We're also seeing the idea that that you can have a sense of taste from a regional perspective if your lamb or your pork or your beef is from there. And I think also there's this focus now on thinking about regenerative farming and regenerative farming techniques. This concept of if you don't use it, you lose it. And there's lots of breeds, old breeds, or can we say things on the taste of bark slow food, where we're seeing, produce and perhaps, if not championed and used on menus through restaurants, would lose that identity with those products and those areas forever. So I think there's this reconnection with the land, goes with also reconnection with what we consider to be indigenous produce or breeds as well. And I think that's really where we are in terms of how we can tell a story about food through where we are in our regions. And I think people like that as well. And that's very much really a cultural thing with food. And we talked about where there's great culture, there's always great food. Well, we kind of lost our food identity in the UK. So it's nice to see that we're reconnecting a little bit of that food story through locally sourced and locally produced product coming on to the menus and becoming a feature. And actually farms, even chefs now have got their own farms, they're growing their own produce, and they're featuring that on their menu too. And that's a really important, the impact that has on the environment is also something that you need to recognize as well.
Suppose it feels a bit like consumers are sort of reappreciating or gaining a new appreciation of what the UK really sort of has to offer. And I think it's maybe come at a time as well where people are doing that travel wise as well. So like the staycation kind of boom that I think was driven partly by the pandemic, but then since then they seem to have come quite hand in hand. So people exploring new places around the UK, but then also wanting to try what the local ingredients and food are.
Holly, I really think that's a good point. I think it's last 2 years we've invested in the UK economy. We've all travelled abroad and been inspired by that, and food's no different. And we're always looking for the next food trend to inspire us, and I think that's really important. So what we've also need to recognise is we can bring some of those eclectic flavours from around the world and apply them to what we have here in the UK. I mean, the fact that our vegetables are from the local farm doesn't stop us from turning that into a deliciously inspired meal from Sri Lanka or Pan Africa. So, I think what we're sort of seeing is that these other cultures that are using plant-based as part of their meal base fit quite well with our own diets, but also within our own farming techniques here, because there are certain things and ingredients that we can grow really well, and they fit quite well within certain diets. So I think it's really important that we continue to inspire local food with the world of food and the taste of the world of food, because now in Britain, we know that our consumer is very, very educated when it comes to tastes of the world. You go to a supermarket and you see the ingredients that you've got, but you could also recognize that we're eating foods from South America, Asia, and also Europe. And in Europe it could be Spanish, Italian, it could be all types of different foods that we're all experiencing, and that's and Scandinavian, of course. So it's really interesting where our diets have developed and actually where our food tastes are now.
Do you think psychologically that adds a sort of premium element to your menu as well? We talked earlier about like the cost crisis and people potentially spending less, but is a lot of research saying that people want to be looking for premium experiences, but does that kind of add to the filter on your menu then?
Well, back along pre-pandemic, people were talking about luxury becoming less a consumer choice, but it's not true. People are still indulging in luxury brands, but there is a reality check that as the consumer has becomes wealthier, they want to improve their knowledge. So what we're finding is that they want immersive experience, and there's an emotional score to that. They also want luxury and quality, but they want that done ethically, and they want to know that you have a strong understanding of what that means. Because whilst they're happy to travel on a plane, when they get there, they want that sort of guilt-free pleasure. They want to know that you've offset some of that, that you're thinking about reducing single-use plastic, that you're buying locally sourced food, and that you're doing it in a seasonal way. But they also want this educational aspect. They want the knowledge. They want to learn and be educated as part of the experience. And what we're finding in the top end is that there's still a huge amount of appetite for people to come and learn about wine, learn about spirits, learn about cocktails. The bars becoming really, really a focal point socially for people again in hotels and restaurants as well. We're seeing that people, perhaps younger generations, don't drink as much, but they're happy to eat out and drink socially, but they're less obsessed. The binge culture that was my generation has gone to become socially accepted. It's not necessarily acceptable to be antisocial, and socially people are a lot more engaged on their phones than perhaps the previous generations. So they're much more into the imagery of food and much more, but they're still very, and also the travel. And so this idea that people can still have those flavors of the world back at home are really important. And I think for me, as I look at luxury also, there's something to be really valued in something as precious as something that is local. We have to start to value what we have locally. And if that is under threat through both economic circumstances and environmental circumstances, then we need to understand that food is not cheap anymore, that food as a resource is going to get more expensive, and that actually we're going to have to start to pay more per capita, per person's income towards food. And for it to be more sustainable, we also need to offset the cost that if you're eating in restaurants, the reality is people are being paid more, and heat and the light is going up. And so there's no such thing as a cheap night out anymore. So we have to start valuing what we've got. And I think that's an educational thing too. And when I think about, how people are interacting with food and in a very high end, it's about the creativity of the chef as well. It's about their ability to take humble foods, which perhaps are inexpensive, but turn them into things of value. And that is through great technique and a wonderful ability to cook and present that in a really welcoming and really luxurious environment. And that doesn't mean to say that just because you're using, I don't know, a less valuable resource of ingredients, that you can't cook that in a luxury and give it a luxury feel. So I think what we're seeing is that, people aren't necessarily defining luxury through prime cuts of meat. They're not. They're doing it through the ability to turn that into an amazing, tasty food, whether it be vegan or vegetarian food. At the end of the day, it still takes the same time, effort, and money to invest to make that product a really tasty and enjoyable, well presented product. So we're seeing that the people's effects, through their diets is having impact, their dislikes and likes, and their allergens and their preference choice when it comes to being vegan, vegetarian, or pescatarian. These are all having real effects on the way that we're thinking about the luxury market. But there's a massive appetite for people to go out and spend good money on eating out through fine food and wine. And that trend's not stopping. We're seeing our customer becoming younger. So historically, that customer base used to be in its 70s. They're now in their mid 40s. And we're seeing that people are engaging with food a lot earlier, but they want that immersive experience. They want the knowledge, and they want to know that you're doing your bit to safeguard the environment.
It's interesting you say about the kind of the emphasis on, I guess, like the aesthetics of food as well as the ingredients and how it tastes. And I think you're right with people using social media more, and every sort of other table in a restaurant has people taking pictures of their meals to post on Instagram. And in our trends, when we were looking at the Nature's Gift trend, we visited a few different plant-based restaurants. And one of the things that we really noticed was that, a lot of the dishes, because they are using natural ingredients and plants, they're really, really colourful. And I think that trend kind of lends itself well to really, like attractive, aesthetically pleasing food. One of the things that we found, I suppose, a bit surprising with our research was that there seems to be a bit of a gap in the market at the minute for people wanting vegetarian dishes, because I think there's been quite a move towards the vegan diet and a focus on plant-based, strictly vegan dishes. And a lot of operators seem to have the sort of main menu and maybe a vegan menu. And there's not as much emphasis in some places on vegetarian meals. Is that something that has surprised you, or is it something that kind of rings true to you in your restaurants and hotels?
Yeah, I think what I would take from that is when the minority reality has an impact on the majority of the choice. And what I mean by that is that, look, when you're preparing menus, your window of creativity and having, for instance, let's just say 30% of our customers is now looking to be vegan or vegetarian. And of that, only 10% are vegan. The problem is, for the restaurant, they need to always cater to the 10%. So what tends to happen is that the vegan and vegetarian menu becomes the vegan menu. which is then suitable for vegetarians, which then means to say that, you're ticking those two boxes with one menu choice. So I think really what you're seeing is that a lot of people are overcompensating for the vegan choice and then ticking the vegetarian box as part of the same, where they're not. So what I would say to that is, yes, I can understand. But I think what's interesting is that now when people are talking about plant-based, they're not talking about veganism. They're talking about they're choosing to eat vegetables because they want a better diet. They're not saying we're not saying we don't eat meat. What we're saying is that we want to eat less meat. So what we're actually realizing is that actually, if you've got incorporated on your menu really tasty, diverse, plant-based or vegan and vegetarian choices, people will choose that because they'll just think, well, you know what, I'm just going to eat less meat or less fish. And ditto with fish, we find that actually people are moving towards eating proteins like fish because they find it a lot lighter and easier to digest, and healthier choices too. So things like leaner meats are really important, and move towards less use and reliance on, say, we don't want to necessarily have so much red meat, for instance. So these things are important. Chicken still is very, very popular in a lot of casual restaurants as well. So I can see the gap in the market emerging a little bit as you go to cater for the extremes. And I think really what we need to sort of do is, we just need to readdress that balance a little bit by choice. But of course, adding choice in menus is really difficult at a time where you're struggling to get staff. And it's okay if you're a big concept that's got a central production kitchen and they send it out to the restaurants from the center to be executed, because you can deal with that a little bit easier. But if you're an independent, you've got to then decide where your menu needs to be focused on. And if the majority of your menu is going to be 80%, people that are wanting to have meat, then that's where you're going to focus. Or you're going to go the extreme and be 100% vegan or 100% vegetarian. And I think, that's where we are. So it doesn't surprise me. But at the same time, it's so much easier to cook for a vegetarian than it is a vegan anyway. So there's an opportunity. But I think, the move towards plant is, as much as it is about anything, it's also about health choice, how about healthy eating and get a better balance in the diet. And this sort of, this idea that, the idea that everybody can afford steak seems to be to the detriment of farming anyway, because there's only so many steaks you can get from the animal, and then the value of the animal needs to be about all the other cuts of meat that you can get on that animal. So, I think carcass balance and addressing menu balance is really important as part of the argument. And when you're talking about that gap that's emerging with vegetarian, I think that's because we're trying to cater for the extremes.
That's really interesting. And you kind of touched upon it a bit with your answer there and talking about the challenges you're facing. Obviously, with the impending recession that we're all talking about, everyone's talking about, what learnings do you think that you've gained from previous recessions that you think could help with hospitality businesses to be more resilient in the face of the difficult conditions that they're going to face in 2023?
Yeah, very good question. When I read that question, I thought, well, first of all, it makes me feel old, and because I'm in my 50s, so I've been through a lot. I think what I'd probably say is that, look, when I look at the recessions we've had in the past, they were slightly different, but what tends to happen is that the top and the bottom seem to be resilient. So the lower entry level and the higher entry level and the higher, they were okay, and it's a bit in the middle, it's a sandwich in the middle that tends to thin out. And I think, if you think about it from a retail concept point of view, places like Poundland sort of sprung up that in the 2006s, with people looking to get more for their pound. The reality now is that the situation we're in now is a combination of a few, very specific issues. One is obviously the energy costs. Two is the headache, if you like, from Brexit, also the acute shortage of staff. And three is obviously you can't escape the fact that, cost of living, pay rises and all of these things are having a big impact on our businesses. So we're seeing less demand in our restaurants because we see a fall in demand because people obviously have less to spend. We have, businesses that haven't been able to grow and expand their business in the last 2-3 years. So they've got very tough challenges with cash flow. And so what we're seeing is that there's a lot of businesses now that are simply running out of energy and money and can't keep up with the cost of living. And, you know, if you put the wages up, if we put the prices up, then at a time where people can't afford to go out, then it's kind of like a perfect storm of bad scenarios. So my feeling, objective feeling here is that we're not immune from it at all. In fact, is look, you know, we just have to play the long game. We need to think about how we can get through the next 6 months, you know, through the winter, because a lot of us have traded, you know, through some difficult winters in the last 2-3 years. A lot of businesses have taken on additional debt through COVID loans that they have to service. And now they're at a particularly difficult point where they're perhaps not getting the businesses through the door at a crucial time, which means, say, the cash flow really difficult position. So, and still struggling to find staff. So I think what will happen is the staffing issue becomes less of a factor as people close their businesses or not able to reopen. And I think which is a shame, but the reality is as restaurants close, that'll sort out perhaps some of the challenges in the labor market. And I think, you know, as the recession eases, businesses need to think forward about how they're going to attract people back into their businesses. And so therefore, you know, looking at some of these trends now and incorporating them into their business plan in 6, 8, 12 months down the line, I think is quite important, because, you know, as people reemerge out of a recession, they'll first of all, they want to go out and enjoy life again, which is a bit like after the pandemic. But at the same time, they want to make their money will be tight, and they want to make decisions based on quality at very different levels. So I think, you know, you still got to invest in quality. You still got to try and grow your business for serving, you know, really great tasting and well served restaurants. You know, we need to keep investing in the skill in our staff to make sure that we come out of this in a stronger position. But you know, I know that there's going to be a squeeze, and I think, you know, that squeeze is inevitable. And I just hope that, you know, we can see some relief in some of the challenges, so that we can, you know, see more businesses survive. You know, and I think, you know, part of the reason why we then start to looking at cheaper cuts of meat and cheaper produce is because we're looking to offer the customer more value. So if, for instance, you've got less to spend, you've got to make it attractive. So somehow you've got to, you know, say to people who've got less money, well, come and you can eat out more because we're going to offer you, you know, more value for lunch, for instance. But that's difficult to service when you haven't got any staff. And I think what we've seen recently is a lot of restaurants closing on Mondays and Tuesdays and not opening for lunch because they don't have the means to do it. So it's kind of like a really difficult one to predict, because it's not like any others. I mean, each one is very, very different, and they all have their challenges. But normally a boom bust recession is generally kind of hits you in a certain way. And with the last 10 years, we've all been used to cheap money. And so, you know, as your interest rates go up, that's going to affect every household in every way. And I think that's a challenge. Is if people think 4.5% is a high interest rate, well, back in the 80s, it was 15%. So, you know, there's a long way to go before people start to get to there. But I don't think we'll get that high. But what I'm saying is that ultimately, if you base your whole sort of business plan and your personal life on low interest rates, then clearly now we've got less money in our pocket at a time where there's other factors coming in to squeeze. So I think it's uniquely difficult. Energy costs are going to stay high for a while, it seems. You know, I'm kind of sat there feeling like I want to be Mystic Meg and see a way through it all. But I know that it's just going to be a little bit of a tough time for a lot of businesses. And I think those that have struggled to get through the pandemic, this is almost like a more challenging time than, because there's no government support. So we don't have any furlough, we don't have any VAT relief, we don't have any business. Well, there are some rate reliefs, but it's going to be challenging. And I think the key thing is the domestic market has also gone overseas again. So, you know, whereas before that domestic market was staycation, that was boomed, that was a real help for us to recover. But if people start to travel abroad again, then obviously then that's going to have an effect too. It's a bit concerning when it's cheaper to go on holiday in Spain for the winter than it is to stay at home and heat your house. So that's where we're at. But that's just shows how bizarre life's become.
On that sort of topic, I guess, talking about the challenges operators are facing cost-wise, and I guess not just operators, but consumers as well. Purse strings are much tighter for consumers. And I think one thing that we're really noticing is that, I suppose for operators, it's harder to justify consumers spending more money when they're out. Are there any of the trends that we've mentioned that you feel are most kind of beneficial to chefs from a profit perspective, maybe helping justify higher costs? Or equally, I suppose on the flip side, maybe trends that lend themselves well to mitigating costs? I suppose there's a bit of both.
Yeah. Well, I think I think ultimately costs are we can't take those costs. The margins of profit are slim in food anyway, and have been reasonably slim for a while. And I would say that, you can't I think we have to accept, the consumer has to accept that, once you have inflation, the reality is those prices tend to be baked in. I don't think that I was looking at my menus for the last 10 years and there seems to be a sort of this magical formula that starters should be about £10 and main courses should be around 20 and desserts around 8. Well, that's been like that for a very, very long time. And I don't think it's like in the supermarkets when you go to shop. I don't think you can artificially suppress the price to the customer by then going back to supply chain and suppressing their margins. I mean, there's only so much you can do before it becomes completely unviable. I think what we have to acknowledge is that, look, things are going to get more expensive, but we can still offer great value. And perhaps, things like, when you're talking about pizza evolution, look, pizza is a very inexpensive way of eating, but then so is plant-based food, so is, and so are, a lot of other foods which are perhaps starch-based, whether it be risottos or lentils or poses. There are lots of different delicious ways of cooking all of these different types of proteins, which are also nutritionally good for you and healthy. And I think, part of the way that we can move forward is to understand that if we can make a less known and less valued ingredients become valuable through creative cooking, then that's going to help get that balance in the menu, but it also help you become perhaps more profitable. But I think we also need to recognize that the consumer is going to perhaps eat out less. I mean, I was in London the other day and there seems to be no shortage of people eating out in fancy restaurants. But London is a bit of a bubble. But when you get outside that bubble and you go within the rural communities or within the communities, they simply don't have any pubs. Pubs aren't opening. Pubs are closing. And it's becoming more and more difficult for people to find places to eat out that they can afford. And I think really it's a really challenging aspect that if you can't staff businesses and you can't offer somewhere for people to go, then that's one of the problems. The other problem you've got is that things are very, 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 very tourist dependable. Places like Cornwall, Devon, there's still lots of the rural economy that's very, very, very seasonally based. So that becomes an issue. So I think what I would say is that some of those trends that you pointed on talk about where the consumer is going in terms of their choices. I think, we can certainly, bring that feeling of travel, the world of travel being available through our restaurants. So that's certainly a more affordable way of going out and eating around the world is to bring the world of food closer to home. I think conscientious choices, I think we've got to think about that as what we put on the menu. That applies to chefs and restaurateurs, perhaps a bit more carcass balance. We use lesser known cuts of meat, lesser known choices of fish, which are more sustainable as well. So I think, we look at everything, don't we? We look at perhaps models of way that you can order your food, you order at the table and your drinks, and we reduce the amount of service we give in restaurants. You change the concepts a little bit in that regard. But I think we're in for a little bit of a hard time, but these emerging trends are just what they are. They're emerging and you can't afford to ignore them, but you need to put them in the context of the challenges that we have within the industry today. For the consumer choice, well, there'll still be perhaps a lesser market, but our market nevertheless is we are still a wealthy country. And I see that we are more of an eating out, certainly now more of an eating out culture than we are eating in. So, I think we just need to perhaps think that perhaps people are only going to have one meal a day as opposed to two big meals a day. So perhaps when they have that meal, they want it to be nutritious, they want it to be balanced, and they want good choice. So maybe, that's some of the realities we need to think about. If you're not open for lunch, you're only open for dinner. That means to say people might change their eating habits for lunch and then eat, or vice versa. So we just need to understand that, there's opportunities within the market, but also there are trends emerging and challenges that we need to combine to stay relevant and also stay profitable.
I know you've always done quite a lot of work to support up and coming chefs. So when you're talking to chefs nowadays, what tips do you give them on how to keep menus current, interesting and compelling enough to attract customers through the door and keep them coming back?
Well, service is still key. Great service, good value for money. The perception of value for money. Well, you can get good value at £10, or you can get good value at £100. The first thing people notice when you come through a door is the atmosphere, the smell, and the buzz, and then the interaction with your customer is about that smiling face. And then you're going in, the place is buzzing. It's a great atmosphere, and then you sit down, and then it's all about then the journey of the customer. From the moment they come through the door to placing the order to experiencing the food. And, people generally choose, because when they look at a well-balanced menu, they choose stuff they want to like to eat. So there's the obvious opportunity is then if you want to eat, a wonderful salad of beetroot with goat's cheese or halloumi, you just need to make that really tasty. And what I love about simple food is that actually it's about really the choice of well decision about spicing and what makes food flavorsome. It's the knowledge of the chef and the cultural input that you've got. And it's when you think about the simple foods of Africa that turn into delicious meals, or in the Mediterranean, simple foods in tapas style or eating plates, small plates of eating, or Japanese and Asian food, it's always about that focus of flavor. And so for me, I just think to people, I say, look, to make people come back, first of all, you've got to make them feel welcome. They need to feel that they've had a really good experience, some really lovely flavors food that kind of relates to the concept that you're trying to create. And ultimately they leave feeling they've had good value. And they want to come back, and if you can keep that magic formula going, a happy customer will tell a friend, and a friend will then tell another friend. And then word of mouth is the slowest way of developing a business, but it's the best way. But these days it's more instant, because people can post a comment, and then you can then echo that comment through your own social media. But look, it's really important that we give what I call authentic interactions for our guests. There's no good selling the dream, and when they get there, it's all disappointing. So you have to work really, really hard from the moment people walk through the door to the food they're eating to when they say goodbye, to ensure that they have a great experience and they want to come back. And that's not easy to do. I appreciate it. So if you've got to create a destination restaurant, you've got to understand why people would choose to come to you as opposed to everyone else, because there's a lot of choice in the market. You also need to think about what's going to define you in terms of what's your, what are you going to focus on? And then you execute it really well. And those touch points that we talked about, first impressions all the way to the last impressions, are really important we get it right, because in a competitive market, it's those people that do those things well that will survive.
It's interesting you say that about the sort of environment and service as well. We actually just did some research recently on children and parents. So we surveyed both. And it's really interesting sort of getting the difference in priorities from children compared to from parents. And one of the things that stood out was that when they were looking at sort of venue of choice, if they were going out as a family, one of the main things they look for is a child-friendly atmosphere. So it indicates that people just want to feel comfortable where they are and kind of welcome, as opposed to feeling on edge or uncomfortable.
That's interesting, because it also supports the demographic that if people are going out, certainly at the top end in luxury, to be more in their late 40s, it's also meaning that the chances are they're going to be turning up with kids. So we also see the whole dog friendly, child friendly as a very important trend, as people choose to go away or eat out without excluding the family. And actually, so many people have said that whilst the food's important, the atmosphere and the gathering of friends and being with people is equally important in a great atmosphere. And if the food doesn't distract but enhances that, brilliant, because what's distracting is when you get bad services and bad food, and then it becomes really annoying for people to sit there and try and have a family celebration only for it to be distracted by bad food, bad service. So absolutely, I think it's interesting how people are seeing eating out to be much more of a family thing rather than just couples.
We were talking about our retro love trend earlier, and that whole kind of emphasis on wanting to provoke a sense of nostalgia with consumers. Is there any sort of dish or dessert or cocktail that you particularly love that gives you a sense of nostalgia, or anything you remember from childhood, say, that you just, or something you'd see on a menu that you would really enjoy?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I always, you talked about desserts. I always remember the Black Forest Gâteau as a kid was very, very popular. And, that combination is classic. But, something is, for me, that kind of comfort thing, it's still very, very popular, but things like, crumbles are really humble, and crumbles, I love crumbles, very, very humbling. The creme brulee is making a bit of a comeback as well. But also, I think, from things that are classics that never dry out, you think like Negronis, and, people are starting to appreciate. Also, whilst, gin has sort of had a very, very successful period, people also looking back and sort of appreciating, I know things like sherry and Madeira and Vermouth are coming back. It's almost like there's a load of drinks out there that people are rediscovering. I know rum is on the up, and so is tequila, but that is good. But I also think there's an emerging interest in British wine as well, in English wines is coming out. But when I look back and I think about nostalgia, I do recognize that in desserts in particular, we're seeing some of that nostalgia coming into menus. And I think in terms of British cuisine, it's really difficult, because if you're thinking about nostalgia when it comes to British cuisine, so much of what we've done in the past has been shaped by the French or the Europeans. But I also think that it's still incredibly popular. How Sunday roasts are still very much a part of people's eating out culture when it comes to the weekends. You wouldn't believe how many people still, and even us, seek out a great Sunday roast. And I think that whole concept of family time around the table, that is still very relevant, and whilst it's still also very nostalgic, because and I'm thinking about that as we approach the Christmas. It's amazing to think that the Christmas dinner, the turkey and all the trimmings still dominate our Christmas landscape. And if it's the vegan, it's everything else except for the turkey, or so vegetarian. But ultimately, it's amazing how we hold on to those nostalgic things like Christmas dinner and the Christmas party, and then Boxing Day, and then and New Year's. But when we do, and I think it's really important. I think also it's important that we have these periods in the year where we can all get together and celebrate, and Christmas is one of them. So I still think Sunday roast, getting the family together on a Sunday is still almost like a ritual thing. Still has a lot to do. I think the Christmas pudding's quite nostalgic. That'll be coming back with a bang as well. But I also think things like Baileys, that's Baileys. It's kind of like it's a once a year kind of drink, but actually we're seeing more and more people drink that outside of their traditional times. So I think for me, nostalgia, I don't really have a kind of go-to kind of nostalgia, because it's kind of almost a living nostalgia, because as a chef you're always in people's consciousness that there are these things that are quite nostalgic, which are still relevant now, which people say, oh my god, I remember that as a kid, going to my grandparents and always have a crumble, and they see it on the menu. And that's why I think you still see a lot of those desserts, still what we call them sort of comforting desserts, still very much there, and I just think that they'll always have a place, and it's a bit like fashion. There's certain things that never really go out of fashion, and they're always around, but it's like the little black dress, it's always there are certain things that are timeless, and I think food has that. There are certain things in food that have that similar appeal.
And as someone that has a sort of sweet tooth as well, I definitely agree with all those ones. They're all the sort of things that I think of in nostalgia, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's been great hearing your opinions, and I really hope it's sort of spurred some ideas for many development for our listeners as well. But Before I wrap this episode up, I just want to say, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I could listen, I could ask you questions all day.
Thank you, Joe and Holly. It's been a real pleasure. And perhaps I'll come back in the future to talk about trends and maybe even see if I got it right.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you on.
Thank you.
So, Holly, Michael was absolutely brilliant there, wasn't he?
Yes, so interesting. I feel like you said, we could have spoken to him for hours and just asked endless questions.
Yeah, absolutely. But was there anything in particular that you took from that conversation that really stood out to you?
I guess the main thing I think was, I know we were discussing at the beginning, I suppose the sort of importance of trends in general. And I think it's very easy for people to potentially think that trends maybe should take a bit of a backseat when we're going through a crisis. And I think, what Michael was saying about actually enticing customers through the door and really keeping up to date on trend menus. So just the importance of them in general was definitely a takeout for me. What about you, Joe?
I mean, I totally agree with you, really. I really liked his comment on the sort of trends being accelerated through crisis. And I think that's really, really key in terms of the cost of living crisis and the trends that are up on the horizon as well. So I think that's really good to hear. And also, Holly, just before I end the episode, how can our listeners find out more about the trends we've discussed today?
If they head to our trends web pages, the links will all be in the show notes. And we've also got an interactive trends guide on there as well, which is full of hints and tips, recipes, and lots of inspiration on how to implement the trends.
And of course, thank you so much for joining me as co-host for this episode, Holly.
Thank you for having me back. And I'll be back again in the new year with a few more trends episodes as well, which I'm looking forward to.
And thank you for everybody for listening to this. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure you follow us to ensure you're the first to hear our latest episodes. But until next time, goodbye.